Greetings all, Professor Garrett here with Dr. Harbison, and we wanted to take a few minutes to make a conversational video about an extremely important movement, but often overlooked exercise, and it's typically due to its difficulty, and I'm guilty of that as well. So today, we are going to be discussing the pull-up, and specifically addressing different variations, its purpose, as well as some common errors, and also how to walk someone through never being able to do a pull-up or not being able to do a pull-up all the way to being able to do the pull-up, and how we can overload the system to continue building strength for this particular movement. So when we talk about purpose, Dr. Harbison, what would you say is a primary purpose of a pull-up for you?
There's a lot of applicability, obviously, with that movement towards other exercises and other movements. I'm going to let you kind of discuss some of that. For me, one of the nice things I see with the pull-up, I specifically this morning as I was thinking about this video, one of the things I see with a young child is kids oftentimes will be, grabbing something and pulling and hanging on to something. It's a natural movement for us to at least to hold on to something or to hang from something. Oftentimes, you're not going to see your kids learning how to do a pull-up right away, but that vertical, essentially the idea of vertical force transmission, right? In kind of this vertical plane, whether you're hanging or pulling or lowering yourself down is a pretty fundamental pattern. And so we see, I see that as kind of something to target. Why would I train this? Well, it's something that we kind of naturally do. I also see, speaking of kind of a hang position, there's potential for kind of rehab or prehab application there in terms of traction, whether we're talking about traction at the spine and just kind of hanging from a bar or some kind of object and letting kind of the spine elongate. There's some application there for injury prevention or kind of just general health. At the shoulder too, we can get a little bit of traction at the shoulder joint, which can be a beneficial thing if we're in an externally rotated position. We'll talk about that a bit. Again, there's a lot of application to other movements. I'm going to let you jump in on that one, Dr. G, and discuss kind of how that influences other potential fundamental movements that we see.
Yeah, I think the purpose for me is, of course, to develop some grip strength. It's a grip dominant exercise, as well as developing some upper back strength, as well as hypertrophy. But also the deep meaning for me is its transferability to other exercises. And even though it's specifically for the upper body, for me personally, I mean, it has such value to something like a squat, something like a deadlift, or anything that requires a connection between the upper and lower half. Even a lower body dominant exercise can benefit from having upper body strength and coordination. And so a pull-up is a great way for developing that. I mean, when you watch people fail with a squat, it's oftentimes because they start to protract and round at the shoulder, and they start to pitch forward. And because they're pitching forward, the weight is now further away from their center of mass, thus making it more difficult to perform the exercise. So interestingly, a limiting factor for a squat might not even be leg strength. It could be upper back strength. That's not always the case, but it certainly is an argument for the value of making sure that the upper body isn't the limiting factor for a lower body exercise. So I think that's probably the biggest thing for me, is the transferability of a pull-up for many other movements, even something like a bench press, and creating a stable shoulder from the backside, even though it's an anterior dominant movement being the bench press. So I think that's—
talk about kind of the connection between upper and lower. And I think, for me, at least, I think of, as you're saying that, I was thinking like the thoracolumbar fascia and how the lats kind of tie into that. We see a lot of that kind of contralateral latissimus and gluteus activation. There's that kind of crisscross pattern that happens across the posterior chain. And so that's certainly one piece of the puzzle as to why we would want to incorporate strengthening and utilization of those muscles. So yeah.
You know what too, and not to get too far off track here, but I really do see this as a movement that demonstrates someone's strength. Like, you get someone that's 200 pounds and they can rip off 10 dead hang pull-ups, that person's pretty strong. I mean, it doesn't mean that their lower body is, and we can get into the weeds with that, but in general, there's not many people that can do 5 dead hang pull-ups. So in reality, whether it's trained or untrained, I mean, you can have someone that does lat pull downs all day long, but can't do a pull-up. And so I think there's like value in just the strength. It's a measurement of strength. basically for me.
It's one of those things you can't fake pull-up strength, right?
Nope.
It's like
Nope.
it's a dead giveaway to investment of time in training of some types. Let's say gymnastics. They're not
Hmm.
necessarily in the gym hitting pull-ups all the time, but gymnasts can rack off a ton of pull-ups, right? Because they're
Sure.
doing that same type of, they're hitting this position over and over and over. Same thing for people who are in the gym and spending a lot of time there. It usually takes years to build up that level of strength to where you can, rip off, sets of, let's say, 15 or more,
Hmm.
with strict body weight pull-ups. So it's one of those movements that if you see someone who's good at pull-ups, they've put in the time. You can't fake it.
Right. And speaking of, I mean, I couldn't do a pull up until after college, to be honest with you. I was a collegiate athlete, and it was one of those movements that I just feared. It's a tough one. Like it's not easy.
Not easy.
So yeah, and so like I said, for me at least, it was a testament to whether or not it's a check-in, if you will. So
Yeah.
we're talking about the pull-up, but you and I know there are many variations to that. So what are a couple common variations, and then maybe we'll address some of the more exotic or ones that are less not used as often, let's say.
Sure. I think of, right off the top, there's your obvious kind of neutral, or let's say pronated grip. The strict pull up, kind of hands just a little bit wider than shoulder width, hanging from that position. You can get the wide grip, the narrow grip, everything with that same kind of pronated grip. There's obviously pull up stations. You see different gym apparatus that have different grips that you can change the angles, whether it's kind of slightly angled, neutral with kind of the palms facing each other. Obviously the chin up with a supinated grip. Then kind of the more exotic, at least for me, I think of different grips as far as ropes, or you can loop a towel over a bar, start working more on grip strength. You talk about building grip strength. Do sets of pull-ups holding onto a towel or a rope. Man, that's challenging there. Yeah, what else? Are there any others that I'm missing that you think of?
Yeah, there'd be just varying the type or the challenge of the grip. So if you have a thinner bar versus a thicker bar, I've seen implements where you have to kind of cup. There's like a tennis ball, you can put that on top of your bar and drill it in. There's obviously those rock pieces that you use to get more of like a finger grip. Also,
Yep.
just a mixed grip, putting one prone, one supine. That's one that I play around with, especially when I'm fatigued. That's one that I find to be helpful because there's a little bit more a different recruitment for each of those hands. So, but make sure that you're switching those. So if you do 10 this way, do 10 this way. But yeah, you've covered all of the main grips, I think, for me. And now with variation, why would I do these various grips? What does that do both from a superficial and then perhaps even a deeper meaning when we talk about planes and things like that?
Yeah, the planes was the first thing I thought of as far as how do we target maybe the frontal plane versus the sagittal plane. So we talk about either a wide grip or some kind of the pronated grip, hands either kind of standard or a little bit wider. Typically, we're going to be pulling down straight, directly into that frontal plane.
Mm-hmm. Because the shoulder is abducting and adducting.
Thank you.
By going in this direction. Yeah.
Yep. Versus if, let's say, we're doing a chin up with a close grip, or even you could have a pronated grip,
Mm-hmm.
and if it's a close grip, we're seeing more flexion and extension of the shoulder in the sagittal plane.
Mm-hmm.
So we can attack the planes in a different manner in that way. I'm trying to think back to what was the original question. I jumped into planes right away. That's where my brain.
Yeah, just variations, and then within those variations, why would we do the various styles essentially? And so,
Go ahead.
Yeah, for me, when I'm thinking of something in the frontal plane, if I'm pulling down and driving my elbows into my sides, this to me is the exact setup as something like a back squat. So like I talked about before, if I'm able to pull and be strong in this position, when I'm squatting, it's an isometric contraction and I'm holding this so I'm not protracting and rounding forward or breaking at my spine, thus not having a neutral spine anymore and changing mechanics and difficulty of the movement. So I think for things like a squat, I love to do pronated, wider, or just making sure that my elbows or my shoulders are abducting and adducting. But for kind of depth, so maybe like aesthetics, I would say for depth of back, and also for things like a deadlift, where we're kind of requiring an isometric contraction with our shoulders in kind of this extension, or we're fighting it from being in flexion and extension and trying to hold that position. I like doing chin-ups, close grip pronated or neutral. And plus, honestly, again, superficially for me, it's just nice to mix it up. Like it gets boring to just, here you go,
Yeah, I
just,
mean that's one of the other. I mean, one of the other purposes that we can throw in there for the pull-up
mm-hmm.
is talking about muscular hypertrophy, muscular strength. You want to be able to mix up, as we would see with anybody who's doing bodybuilding or something like that. You're always attacking things from different angles, kind of manipulating the stimulus a little bit just to make sure that we're not hitting the same thing over and over and over.
Mm-hmm.
To add whether it's kind of width of the back or perhaps depth or thickness. There's kind of anecdotal reports about different grips and different styles of pull-ups having a different effect on the musculature in that sense. So certainly
Mm-hmm.
some application there.
Yeah. So we got some variations. What about, we're talking about different ways you can do it. What are ways not to do the pull-up?
Yeah. So I think any of us who've been to a gym and kind of watched people, as you said, this is a difficult movement. And so starting off, if you're not able to do even one pull-up, technically your technique and your form is probably not going to look great right away. One of the most common ones I see is elevation of the scapula, elevation of the shoulders. Kind of you see this kind of almost like a rounding and an elevation of the shoulder at the same time, kind of bunching the shoulder up vertically. I would say the other main one I see, I don't know if it's as common, but I kind of briefly mentioned the importance of external rotation. We're trying to get some external rotation torque at the shoulder as you're doing this movement. So the opposite of that would be internal rotation. If you try and internally rotate your shoulder in an abducted or elevated position, it automatically kind of elevates the shoulder capsule there. So it's a similar kind of pattern to the error I mentioned. The other thing we need to be careful of, internal rotation and abduction or flexion of the shoulder is the test for shoulder impingement. So we want to avoid that combination of internal rotation and elevation. So when we are in that pull-up position, that's why I mentioned having kind of that external rotation torque. I've got sleeves, so I apologize, you can't really see, but kind of getting the elbows, think of rotating the elbow kind of so it's facing more anterior. Yeah. So yeah, avoiding internal rotation, elevation of the shoulder is kind of one of the big ones I see. How about you?
Yeah, well, just to add to that, I would also say that not only is it a common fault, but it's making sure that we are not reinforcing poor movement. Like we want to reinforce quality movement, because if imagine you do 10 sets of 10 or what, I mean, that's a good amount, but we're assuming we're building volume with this exercise and the majority of our reps are in this kind of poor position, even if we don't get hurt from it, that now becomes our default. So now when we're playing sport, we're rounded forward, or when our posture, I think you've mentioned this before, we're already sitting like this all day long. This is the standard American right here, right? Or this down looking at the phone. So yep. This is our default position now. And if we're going to go into the gym and try to correct some of this stuff, man, we need to be solid quality reps. And this is another thing, and maybe it'll transition us into the loading or the life cycle of a pull-up. But man, I really think it's important to note that it helps develop a good default posture. Right. One other thing that I see as a common fault is kind of the chicken pecking of the chin. You just reach up, and if the idea, and going back to good posture, is to maintain a neutral spine, maintain a neutral cervical spine, then we don't want to be practicing bad reps. And this will lead us into the life cycle or how to train this movement. But getting your chin over the bar is an arbitrary goal. Like, yes, that's a good end position because it's a full range of motion in general. But then I would argue that your chest needs to go to the bar, or why not continue pulling down? So as far as range of motion, for purposes of that, yes, it's good. But if we're beginning to build strength, I'd rather you miss the bar and just get to your forehead rather than chicken pecking up the extra 3 inches just to say your chin got over the bar. That's not worth it to me. So posture and position is primary over depth or range of motion.
Yeah, the idea of sacrificing movement quality just to reach that arbitrary position, as we would see with a deadlift or squat or any other movement. We don't want to sacrifice technique just to say we completed a full rep.
Right.
So now, safety always has to be first.
Yeah, and again, we want to move through a full range of motion. No doubt there. We're not saying, hey, just do half reps of everything. But if your half rep then causes you to break posture or position, then we have to ask ourselves, is it really worth it? Is the extra 2-3 inches of range of motion going to be valuable for us? And my argument would be no.
That's
So
when you have to go back to the drawing board, figure out why is this
yes,
causing us to break down in technique, and fix the problem first, and then you can start continually building, whether it's range of motion or volume or whatever the case may
right.
be. You brought up that you go back to posture and position, and you mentioned this posture. We're all kind of right now, especially as we're quarantined, sitting a lot more than usual probably, and so this pattern of rounded shoulder and
Mm-hmm.
usually kind of a forward and an extended cervical spine is a fairly common sitting posture. And
Mm-hmm.
as you said, we don't want to start now loading that with external resistance.
Yeah.
But I think that goes back into, as we get into maybe some more nitpicky errors that we see perhaps with the pull-up. I know that's one I see commonly at the top of the pull-up is kind of a collapsing of the
Mm-hmm.
chest, kind of in layman's terms, of rather than pulling the chest to the bar and
Yeah.
getting maybe some thoracic extension and really getting the lats firing a little bit more. It's kind of typically the elbows will come in as we
Mm-hmm.
really kind of try to get a little bit more stretch on the lats. I mean, you look at anatomically speaking with the insertion point of the latissimus dorsi into the humerus, any kind of horizontal adduction is going to stretch that a little bit more. So we might feel a little bit more power from this position, and you'll see that commonly as people fatigue, the elbows will start to
Mm-hmm.
travel inwards a little bit more. But same thing, you get that collapsed chest and the extended cervical spine that we want to avoid throwing
Yeah.
extra load on, to your point. So
Hey, since we're talking about this and perhaps it's even a variation, what are your thoughts on a kipping or a butterfly or basically this movement-based pull-up? Because I mean, that's something to discuss as well.
sure. I mean, the obvious application there is CrossFit. You see the kip kind of popularized there. And so there's
So to be clear, the kip was around much before CrossFit.
yeah,
This is a
the
common movement
popularized.
seen in gymnastics, but in an effort to acquire volume, I
Mhm.
feel like that's the main purpose of it, is to get volume. I mean, there's workouts where you're doing hundreds of pull-ups, and so to do hundreds of strict pull-ups, you're not going to be doing much of anything else.
Yeah, I think as with any movement and kind of looking at why we're doing it the way we are, you always have to ask yourself, what's the goal? What's the
Mhm.
application?
Yep.
And to your point, with whether it's CrossFit or anything else, if you're trying to accumulate a lot of volume, obviously you're not going to be doing super strict
Mhm.
pull-ups for tons and tons of reps. So there's kind of some discussion that could go on there with application. As far as my thoughts on it, anytime you're using a very difficult movement for high reps, I think you have to be more careful about technique,
Mhm.
understanding that perhaps there's let's call it sport application within CrossFit. It is a sport. It's not necessarily just training for strength or endurance. It's, we're doing this for a competition's sake.
Mhm.
Um, so you have to understand that typically when we are putting sport in the equation rather than just kind of a controlled environment, there's more risk. So we need to be aware of that. But also kind of from that perspective, I would say understand what the risks could be with kind of more motion happening at an already very mobile shoulder joint, and take
And under
precautions as
duress because you're doing
necessary.
more volume and so on and so on. So basically, I think we're both agreeing that there's a purpose for it. But in terms of getting you to develop solid mechanics, I would not, for me personally, and this isn't the end all, but I would say let's work on developing a strict pull up. Let's understand quality of movement within that before we're doing kipping pull ups just for pull up sake. Like there's many other ways to get vertical pulls. I mean, here's the thing. Should you do 50 kipping pull ups, and which would get you fatigued or tired, or do 5 strict pull ups? Which one's better? I mean, again, it depends on what you're training for and all these things, but in general, I would say less volume, more quality, because that greater volume is going to make you more susceptible to breakdown at some point. And if you could do 50 quality kipping pull-ups without like poor movement, then I would argue you're probably pretty close to doing 5 strict. So I would rather you decrease the volume, but with quality movement rather than add volume with subpar quality.
Agreed.
Psych. But pretty straightforward, right? Like, don't hurt yourself. That's the point. The point of training is not to hurt yourself; is to prevent injury. So we
Well,
shouldn't
I
be.
mean, we talk about this a lot. It's look at any type of time you talk about training. It's, you always got to look at the long game. We're
Yeah,
not trying to sprint. It's a marathon. So the longer you can you can keep that going, the better quality life is in those later years. So keep
Mhm.
the end goal in mind always.
So we can't do a pull-up. How do we get some volume to, I mean, because that's the only way we're going to be, and I'll default or start here is that the only way to get better at pull-ups is to do pull-ups. Taking them out of your training is not going to help you with pull-ups. So that's why when I see them non-existent in programs, I'm like, man, how are you going to develop this extremely important movement and strength that you get from this particular exercise? So life cycle for you, how do you get someone from not being able to do a pull-up to doing 50 weighted pull-ups unbroken?
Yeah. I've never gotten there. I don't know about you, but
Nope, nope, not even close.
that's an impressive goal. I almost got to 40 once. 37, I think, was my best, but
Nice.
I was back in the day.
Yeah.
So I think one of the things you kind of alluded to is the idea of well, training volume, but frequency, I would say, would probably be the more applicable one. When we're talking about body weight training, and I don't have a research study I can pull up off the top, but at least anecdotally, I've found that with body weight training, it is much more possible to increase frequency of training, i.e., you could probably do it every day, or at least even a few times a day, depending on the other factors, so intensity and volume. But typically, I've found that body weight exercises lend themselves better to greater frequency, and kind of the idea of greasing the groove, right? If a movement is important to you, do it every day. If it's not important, you don't do it.
Yeah.
And of course, you have to consider the other variables. But to your point of how do we start? If you can't do a pull-up, you need to start somewhere. And I would say one of the important pieces would be to frequently begin challenging that pattern. And one of the other things you were alluding to, I think, is when actually training the pull-up. So there are different, I mean, there's contraptions at the gym, whether it's, assisted weight, I don't forget the name of it. It's basically an assisted pull-up where you put your knees on the pad that raises up with you, and you can change the weight with it. But there's also, like, you can have people hold onto your ankles and assist that way. One of the things I would caution with any of those, and anything that gets you away from the actual mechanics of a true pull-up, is it's a slightly different movement. So understand that unless you are actually doing a pull-up, you are not training the pull-up. So for me personally, one of the ways that there's a few ways. The first way that I've found to be successful in training people who are unable to do one strict pull-up is to start with isometric holds. So typically you'll have them either stand on a chair or a box underneath a bar of some kind, either jump up, whatever the case may be. Get to that. What's that?
Jump up there and go and show it.
I will. Let me explain first. That way I'm not out of breath.
What about those 40 pull-ups?
So it's, and with that kind of a disclaimer, we know that with isometrics, you're only developing strength in that specific range. There's maybe an inch or two of play kind of around that position. So you'll need to start, if you're trying to target the top position, then maybe drop a couple inches, etc. So you're targeting isometric holds throughout that range of motion. And similarly, eccentrics. So isometrics and eccentrics would be where I would start first, working on kind of a slow descent eccentrically. I'll go ahead and demonstrate. So for isometric, we would jump up here, maybe here, and here. So pick maybe 3 or 4 spots within that range of motion. Again, understanding that isometrics are only targeting that specific area, but do it for time. That's how I would start with a time component, time under tension, and then the eccentric component. Same idea. You're going to kind of erase the concentric, and then slowly.
And as you're slowly going down or holding the isometrics, make sure that you're not here and then that you're holding up like this just for more time. Like, forget the time. That's ideal. Like, we want to hold it for as long as possible, but not at the expense of all of a sudden being here for an extra 3 seconds. It's just not worth it.
Yeah, agreed. So what else do you have in mind as far as for the beginner?
Yep. Another alternative in order to start getting some volume is going to be right where Dr. Harbison's going, and that's to the band. The band is going to allow you enough assistance to be able to get some volume, but it's not going to, obviously, if you didn't have the band, you wouldn't be able to do it. So you're more or less going to be going through the same range or the same movement. There's not going to be too much variation there aside from having to work around the band a bit. but that's a way to get volume. So maybe you do both. Is one better than the other? I don't know. I mean, I've seen success from both, but the common theme between both of those is repetition, is doing it. So you
Mm.
can't do isometric pull-ups once a week and then, move next week, do the same thing. It's kind of like our spiritual walk, right? You can't just go to church on Sunday and be like, you know, enlightened and following Christ, right? Or nutrition. You can't have one healthy meal and all of a sudden have a six pack. Like, this takes work. So just keep that in mind. And unfortunately, pull-ups are one of those movements that just take a while. At least it did for me. So,
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
but
Yeah, I would agree though, as far as building up that concentric aspect, the band is a really easy way to incorporate that. Obviously, you can get bands of varying assistance to begin working yourself towards a full body weight pull-up. But those, the incorporation of isometric, eccentric, and then maybe an assisted concentric would be the things I would target first.
Yep. And then once you progress there, like as soon as you can do a body weight pull up, I mean, I know it's something my wife and I have worked on. Is I have one of those door jam pull up things, and anytime I walk through a door, I just do max reps pull ups. And so, like, my wife has transitioned from doing the holds to doing one to now doing reams of them. So again, it doesn't. And here's the other thing: is it doesn't only have to be when you're at the gym. This is another one, just like push-ups or any other body weight, that you can do whenever. It's not only in this window of I'm at the gym. Like, jump on a tree and get a couple reps there. I mean, have fun. Like, training should be fun too.
Yeah, I would say the same. I mean, I don't know about you, but I remember when I lived in the city in Seattle, for example. I mean, I've gone to parks and found playground equipment and done pull-ups. There's street signs and city like telephone poles have sometimes a little bar that come off the side of them. Find anything that you can grab onto and pull yourself up. It's if you're creative enough, you can find a way to make it work regardless wherever you are.
Yep. So two final things for me. The first being, so once you do some eccentric, some isometric or band assisted pull-ups, you can progress to doing just body weight, and then we can progress that into overloading by wearing like a dip belt or by using manual resistance. But one other strategy for the beginner is to do body rows, whether it's from a barbell and you're lying prone and you're pulling yourself up. Now, it's not a vertical pull, it's going to be horizontal pulling, but it's still strengthening the back, strengthening the shoulder girdle to prepare for better performance with the pull-up.
And like you said, I mean, because there's applicability of the pull-up to the deadlift, guess what? There's a little bit of applicability the other way too.
Yep.
So developing the entire spectrum there certainly makes sense.
And yeah. So I'll stay there. But hey, there's many options. The best way to start doing pull-ups is to start doing pull-ups, and so. Yeah.
Let me ask you one final question. So as we talk about maybe the other end of the spectrum, so we covered beginner a little bit. So for the more advanced trainee or individual who's able to do many bodyweight pull-ups, when do you begin incorporating external resistance for them, and kind of what does that discussion look like?
Great question. I don't know if it's okay. I don't know if there's a specific marker per se, but I want them to. For me, I like them to be able to do at least 3 sets of 8 or more pull-ups. Because there's really, I mean, hypertrophy is that 8 to 12 rep range. And so, or whatever, 8 to 12 reps is personally where I find like a nice, it's enough to build strength, but it's also enough volume. So if the person can do at least 3 sets of at least 8 reps, let's start adding some weight and making it a little bit more challenging.
What are some of the benefits then? Do you see, I know for me personally, I've seen some benefits with using external resistance and having an influence then on muscular endurance for doing kind of total reps. Have you found much success with that or experimented with that at all?
Yeah. So basically just accumulating volume over a period, or?
So for example, like I bragged a little bit that back in the day, I used to be able to, 37 was my PR, right? So at that time, I was actually, the main component of my pull-up training was actually externally loaded. I was doing sets of 5 to 8 reps. So basically I would kind of build up and progressively overload within that window. As soon as I could do 8 reps with, let's say, 25 pounds of external resistance. So a dip belt was kind of the most common that I used. You can certainly grab a dumbbell between your feet. I remember before I could afford a dip belt, again, way back in the day, I go to the gym, grab a pull-up bar and have your legs hanging straight down and put a dumbbell between your feet.
Mhm.
There's lots of ways you can do this. You don't have to have anything fancy necessarily to overload. But again, the point being, as I developed that kind of in between the strength and hypertrophy range, kind of in that window, that had a great effect then on the total number of pull-ups I can do. And we see that similarly with, let's use the NFL Combine, for example. We see the bench press test. Commonly critiqued, whether it's a good test for those athletes, that's a different discussion. But you look at the guys who can lift the most for 1 rep max, and typically they're the ones that can also pump out 40, almost 50 reps of 225 in the bench test. So that's kind of the area I was thinking of or going towards, is as you develop some of that strength and certainly some hypertrophy in there too, then you see some positive benefit there in the total number of pull-ups that you're able to do. But we always go back to make sure you're doing those with proper technique. For me personally, as I get more external resistance, I find it's very difficult to keep that strict technique. And so the elevated shoulders is something that I have to constantly fight with external resistance, more so than just a body weight pull-up.
Yeah, so maybe your first set is externally resisted, and then the next 2 or 3 or 4 are unloaded, but because you're kind of pre-fatigued, you're still getting the volume that you need to build the capacity, but you are beginning to develop strength by adding some of the overload. So it's not like here's the other thing too, is it's not so rigid either. It's not, hey, if I can't do 3 sets of 8 with weight, I failed. It's not that. So yeah, good stuff.
Yeah. Anything else you want to add? I feel like that's at least a good introductory discussion into some of the things we see with the pull-up and what we're going for. So
Yeah,
appreciate the time there, Dr. Garrett.
likewise. Appreciate your time too. And
looking forward to getting into some other exercises and discussing those as well.
Yep. And those of you watching this, if you have movements that you want to discuss or want to hear us talk about, feel free to reach out and we're more than happy to address those. See y'all.
And do some pull-ups.
Yeah, do more pull-ups.